Did the Bible predict the future? Is biblical prophecy a real thing? We're going to take a look at those questions and the concerns of skeptics here in this episode of Confusing Parts of the Bible. So biblical prophecy is one of the main components of the Bible. It makes up about 27% of the text. So if we can believe in biblical prophecy, that it is inspired word from God, we can believe in the entire book. Not that it's just great wisdom literature for applying to our daily lives, but that we can place our faith in every word that it says. So we're going to get into Daniel chapter 11. Daniel chapter 11 is a fantastic example of biblical prophecy because we can pinpoint each event that fulfilled each one of the prophecies. So we're going to dig into it, and then we're going to answer the skeptics' problems. So let's read Daniel chapter 11, verse 2. I'm going to be reading from the ESV translation, so let's take a look. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Now currently when Daniel is writing this, Cyrus the Great is king, and Cyrus the Great would die on December 4th, 530 BC. So this is talking about the 3 kings right after him. So who is that? Let me fill it in for you. So Cambyses II, Pseudo-Smyrtus, Darius I were the next 3 kings. And then it shall arise a 4th king, Xerxes I. And Xerxes I took his massive empire of very diverse nations and targeted Greece and invaded Greece in 480 BC. Perfect fulfillment of the text. Daniel 11 verse 3. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. So a mighty king will arise. He rises from Greece. Who is that? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great reigned from 336 BC to 323 BC. So a very short reign, but the text says that he will do as he wills because he was completely undefeated in battle. He conquered a major part of the known world and then died in Babylon in 323 BC. And that takes us to Daniel 11 verse 4. As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. So this is predicting that as quickly as his empire is built, it will crumble. And that's exactly what we see fulfilled in the life of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great dies at the age of 32, and his kingdom is broken into 4 pieces with his generals fighting over the rule of the empire. And we see this prophecy fulfilled in that many of the generals tried to reclaim the victory that was once had under Alexander the Great by fighting against each other and trying to reclaim the majority of the empire so that their strength would be just like his, but they're never able to do that. That takes us to verse 5. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be a great authority. So what we see here in verse 5 is the reference to the king of the north and king of the south. And that's in reference to Jerusalem. So anything north of Jerusalem is the north, and anything south of Jerusalem is the south. So the king of the south would become Ptolemy I Soter. Now, he is ruler of Egypt starting in 323 BC as soon as Alexander the Great dies, and he names himself king in 304 BC. Now, it says one of his princes. Why does it say one of his princes? Well, Seleucus I Nicator is trying to rule the area from Babylon that's north and east of Egypt. So it's a huge region, but he's having trouble because many other generals are also vying for the rule of this area. So Seleucus calls on Ptolemy for help. So Ptolemy sends support to Seleucus to establish him as king. So that's why he's a prince, because he needed Ptolemy's help. But it turns out, like the rest of the verse says, that Seleucus's rule was much greater than that of Ptolemy because he ruled over a larger geographical area. A perfect fulfillment of the prophecy. Daniel 11 verse 6. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. There's a tremendous amount of moving parts here in this verse. So here's how it's fulfilled. So there's about a 40-year gap between the events of verse 5 and verse 6. And this verse is predicting the events of the life of Berenice, who is the daughter of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who he offers to Antiochus II Theos to create a peace agreement between the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom. Now, the problem is that Antiochus II is already married to a woman named Laodice, and they have a son, Seleucus II. Well, Berenice and Antiochus II end up having a son, Antiochus III. Well, he's still an infant when Ptolemy II Philadelphus dies. And once he dies, Laodice invites Antiochus II over, and she poisons him, and she has Antiochus III arrested. Berenice is killed by partisans in favor of the reign of Seleucus II, and even the female attendants to Berenice are killed after conspiring to give her dowry to her brother, whose revenge against Laodice is predicted in the next verse. But I want to go ahead and skip to verse 31, where we get to kind of the tail end of the period of the times predicted that have already been fulfilled. So Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So verses 7 through 30 predict the events that cover about 75 years of the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires warring against each other in those specific details. In verse 31, we reach a point in the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes where he is at his worst. He was a horrible, horrible king who was conniving and evil to the core. And this verse, verse 31, is predicting the most horrendous of his acts. So a quick backstory to these predicted events is that Antiochus IV had twice been bribed by Jews to name them high priest, first by Jason and then by Menelaus. Well, Jason wasn't happy about it, so as soon as he thought that Antiochus IV had died in Egypt, he takes 1,000 soldiers into Jerusalem and pushes Menelaus out. Antiochus IV isn't dead, isn't happy about what Jason did, and he storms up to Jerusalem. He goes in, profanes the temple, steals a bunch of the utensils all the way down to the curtains, the table of showbread, everything that was used in worship, and takes them away. And then 2 years later, he sends one of his leaders in with 22,000 Roman soldiers claiming they're coming in peace, and slaughters Jews on the Sabbath day because they know that they're not going to fight back on the Sabbath. They tear down the walls, set up a citadel right next to the temple grounds so that they make sure that nobody worships Yahweh. And then with the help of Menelaus, he comes in and builds an altar over the top of the altar of burnt offerings. And he builds it to Zeus, sacrifices pigs on this altar so the blood drains over the altar of burnt offerings, making the abomination of desolation, where those stones were never able to be used again. Actually, Judas Maccabeus comes in, fights against the citadel, and tears apart the stones, sets them aside, and rebuilds and anoints that altar and rededicates the temple to Yahweh. And that's where the Jews get Hanukkah, because that happened on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, which they equate to December 25th. So I hope you can see, just from discussing those 6 verses, just how perfectly accurate and fulfilled biblical prophecy is. But critics don't have a problem with how accurate and perfectly fulfilled it is. They have a problem with when it was actually written. They claim that it was written after the fact. And they hold that Daniel was probably written by somebody else other than Daniel, in the year about 165 to 160 BC. Now, first of all, there's no question that Daniel is claiming to be the author of Daniel. All the first person pronouns, I, then all the internal details show that it was a first person account. Ezekiel, who is a contemporary of Daniel, names him 3 different times. Even Jesus makes a comment about Daniel being the author of Daniel. It was just an accepted fact that Daniel was the author of Daniel for about 800 years. Not until about 280 AD was it ever even brought into question. So now it comes down to, do we have evidence to support an authorship around 530 BC? And the answer is absolutely. In fact, some of the objections that skeptics try to use against an earlier dating turns out to be in support of an earlier dating when you take a closer look at it. So the first argument that skeptics try to use is the category that the Jews put Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. They put it in the Ketuvim. Now, they would expect it to be in the prophets, but they put it in the Ketuvim. Their argument is that many of the books in the Ketuvim are written much later, so it had to be a later writing. But that's just not the case. Many books within the Ketuvim, or the writings, are written either contemporary to Daniel or much earlier, such as many of the Psalms, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Lamentations. So that's not a good argument. And really, the reason why the Jews put Daniel in the Ketuvim and not the prophets is because they didn't view Daniel as a prophet. They viewed him as a public servant with some gifts of prophecy. They also try to use the outlook of the book as an argument. They think it's too apocalyptic in nature and relates more to later writings rather than the proposed date. But that's not really the case, because Joel and Zechariah have some of the same forms, and even some of the same motifs are found in Isaiah 24 through 27. And those are both either contemporary or earlier. Another objection that skeptics try is that Daniel's name is not mentioned in the book of Sirach that was written in 180 BC. But neither is Ezra or Mordecai or any of the judges. So that's not evidence against their existence. That's just being left out of one text. Another objection that skeptics try to use is the date in Daniel 1 verse 1, where it says that the invasion of Jerusalem happened in Nebuchadnezzar's 3rd year of reign. But in Jeremiah 46 verse 2, it says that that happened in Nebuchadnezzar's 4th year. So they hold that to mean that Daniel must have been so far removed from the actual event that he forgot the correct date. So it must have been a later writing. But that would be ignoring the fact that Daniel adopted the Ascension year chronology since he was in service in Babylon, where Jews use non-Ascension year chronology in counting the reigns of kings. Some skeptics try to use the reference of Darius the Mede as an objection to the book, because there's no other historical records that show this title of Darius the Mede. But there's a lot of plausible explanations for that. It could have been referring to Gubaru, who was the commander who conquered Babylon and then was assigned governorship over the region. The reason he might not have been recorded as having this new title is because he only survived 8 days after the conquer of Babylon. Another possibility is that Darius the Mede was just another reference to Cyrus the Great. We don't know for sure, but it's likely just another reference to someone that we do know about. But of all the arguments that skeptics try to use against the authorship and date of Daniel, the one they use the most is the one of the languages and the grammatical forms of the text. But if we take a closer look, this one really supports an earlier dating. So there are 3 musical terms transliterated from the Greek into Aramaic in Daniel chapter 3 verse 5. And the skeptic's argument is that, it must be written from the Levant after Greek had become a major language in the area if he's using Greek words. But that's a ridiculous argument, because we do this all the time. In fact, the word from Greek that Daniel transliterated is the same word, symphonia, that we get our word symphony. We transliterate that word too. Technical terms are often transliterated. A cappella means to chapel. We don't say to chapel, we say a cappella. Opera means work, but we say opera. Concerto means concert, and a lot of times we just drop the O to get concert, or we just use the term concerto. But you don't accuse us of being Italian, we just transliterate the technical terms. And if this was actually written from the Levant, we would expect a whole lot more than just 3 Greek words. And for a long time, critics actually used the whole Aramaic section of Daniel chapters 2 through 7 against the dating of Daniel. But now most linguists will agree that it's not a late Palestinian form of Aramaic. It's actually using the imperial Aramaic alphabet that we see in Ezra and the Elephantine papyri. which were written during the 5th century BC. Also, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scrolls of Daniel show an internal vowel change in the passives, hopeful rather than the prefix hit. And that proves an earlier dating. And now critics will actually concede that chapters 2 through 7 are in fact written before 300 BC, but they still hold on to 8 through 12 being written much later because of those predicted prophecies. We also see up to 17 Persian loanwords used in the book of Daniel. Skeptics will say, well, it must be written after 539 BC, after the Persians already took over. Clearly, yeah, we're saying about 9 years after, about 530 BC, but the Skeptics is trying to argue that it was written around 160 BC, a date where the type of Persian that is used isn't even in existence anymore, because Daniel used Old Persian technical terms that were not used after the year 300 BC. So again, this is actually in support of a much earlier writing, such as 530 BC. So the Skeptics' claims against the authorship and dating of Daniel actually backfire severely in favor of the earlier dating of 530 BC. So, did the Bible predict the future? Is biblical prophecy a real thing? Absolutely it did, and it is. If this has been encouraging to you, if it's answered some questions you might have had, or clarified some things in the Bible, please share, like, and subscribe. And if you have any questions or any particular parts of the Bible that might be challenging to you, please leave a comment, and I would love the opportunity, God willing, to go through that and dig into it for you and see if I can possibly answer any of the questions you might have about it. So, Lord willing, I'll see you in the next one.